She paid $180 for 30 acres nobody else wanted, and a man behind her laughed loud enough for the whole crowd to hear. She didn't turn around. 6 months later, her goats found something buried under all that thorn that nobody in the county could quite believe. Stay with this one. A row of flat stones lay hidden beneath 10 years of blackberry bramble, too straight and too deliberate to belong to nature. No one had walked that ground long enough to notice. A woman stood at the edge of the auction crowd with her hands folded, watching numbers rise on land no one else wanted. What kind of person bids on 30 acres nobody has touched in a decade? The gavel came down at 11 minutes past 9 that morning, and 30 acres of thorn and cedar in Oakridge County belonged to a woman nobody expected to raise her hand. The courthouse steps in Millbrook were crowded that day, mostly with men in canvas coats hunting for cheap timber ground or a tax lot to flip before spring. Nobody was looking for what Colleen Whitfield was looking for. She was 38 years old, a widow going on 14 months, and the only bid she placed all morning landed on parcel 114, 30 acres along Kettle Hollow Road that hadn't been cleared or walked in over 10 years. "You just bought yourself 30 acres of thorns," a man behind her said, loud enough for half the crowd to hear. Colleen didn't turn around. She reached into her coat, pulled out a worn leather journal with a cracked strap, and wrote a single line before closing it again. "Bought the Kettle place today, $180. Nobody else wanted it. That is exactly why I do." The auctioneer barely paused before moving to the next parcel, as if 30 acres of Kettle Hollow ground had never been worth a second bid to begin with. And Colleen stood at the back of the crowd, a while longer listening to men argue over fence posts and hay equipment before she finally turned and walked back to her truck alone. She drove out to the property that same afternoon instead of going home, parking at the edge of the washed-out logging track and sitting behind the wheel for nearly 20 minutes before she found the nerve to get out and walk in. Nobody understood why a grieving widow would want land that even the county called worthless. 6 months later, nobody could believe what her goats found buried beneath it. If you've ever looked at something broken and seen what it might still become, stay. With this one, the Kettle Hollow property had sat in legal limbo since the early 80s, tangled in a dispute between 3 siblings who stopped speaking after their father passed. No one had cleared a fence line or walked the boundary in years. There was no real road in, only a washed-out logging track that dead-ended in a wall of multiflora rose taller than a grown man. Cedar saplings had claimed what was once open pasture. Poison ivy climbed the old posts like it owned them. By every practical measure, the land was finished. Colleen didn't see it that way. She had grown up 2 hollows over, in a house where her mother canned tomatoes every August, and her father could fix anything with baling wire and patience. After her husband Daniel died on the county highway 18 months earlier, she sold the small house they'd shared outside town and moved back into the hills with almost nothing left but grief, a pickup truck, and a need to build something with her own 2 hands again. She hadn't bought the land because she saw dollar signs in the briar. She bought it because everyone else had already decided it was finished, and after Daniel, she wasn't ready to believe that about anything, not the land and not herself. The first morning she walked the property alone. Before any goat had ever set a hoof on it, she counted 11 steps past the gate before the bramble closed over the old logging track completely, and she stood there alone while just listening to how quiet 30 acres of nobody's land could be. She tried to picture where a house might have stood once, where a barn might have leaned, where a family might have hung washout to dry on a line strung between 2 posts long since rotted away. Everything she could see told her the same story twice, that this ground had been worked hard once, and then abandoned twice as hard. She wrote that first evening that the silence out there didn't feel empty so much as it felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what she'd do next. Word travels fast in a small county, and within a week an old man named Harlan showed up at her gate without being asked. Harlan had spent 31 years as a soil conservationist before he retired, and folks said he was more interested in listening to land than talking about it. He didn't offer advice that first visit. He never did. He stood at the edge of the bramble wall and asked her what grows where the water stays. Colleen admitted she didn't know yet. "Good," Harlan told her. "Then you're paying attention." He came back every few weeks that fall, always carrying a new question instead of an answer, asking her what survives when everything else dies, asking her what the land remembers if a person is willing to ask it. Colleen wrote every question down in her journal and underlined each one twice, because she had learned already that Harlan's questions tended to answer themselves months later, in ways that had nothing to do with words. He never once told her what to plant or where to build, and when she pressed him for a straight answer one cold afternoon in November, he only crouched down, pushed 2 fingers in the soil near the fence line, and told her that the ground would tell her everything she needed to know if she stopped asking it to hurry. He talked about water the way other men talked about weather, saying that water always remembers the path it used to take even after people forget, and that a man or a woman who wanted to understand a piece of land had to first understand where the water still wanted to go. He learned that lesson himself the hard way decades earlier. He told her once, on a job clearing a flooded bottom field for a farmer who refused to believe the old creek bed still ran under his corn until 3 wet springs in a row proved him wrong. Harlan never farmed the Kettle place himself and never asked for anything in return for his visits. And when Colleen offered to pay him for his time that first winter, he waved her off and said the only payment he wanted was for her to keep asking better questions than the one she started with. Colleen didn't fully understand what he meant that day. She understood it a great deal better 6 months later, kneeling in the mud with her hands wrapped around a ring of hand-fitted stone. Clearing 30 acres of briar by hand would have taken years and money she didn't have left. So she did what generations of hill farmers before her had done when the ground turned against them. She brought in goats. 11 Kiko Cross does arrived on a rusted stock trailer in late September, hardy browsing animals bred for exactly this kind of punishing terrain. Goats reach for woody stems and broadleaf plants before they ever touch grass, which made them the only honest tool left for reclaiming ground this far gone. Colleen built temporary paddocks from portable electric netting, moving the herd through tight rotations so they would hit the multiflora rose and blackberry hard before drifting to fresh ground. 3 of the 11 became characters in their own right almost immediately. There was Ruth, a stubborn old doe who led the herd through every gate first and into every unfamiliar paddock without hesitation, standing guard near the netting each evening until the last straggler had settled. There was Biscuit, a young buckling who treated every fence line as a personal insult and slipped it no fewer than 6 times that first season, always found a half-mile off chewing on something he had no business chewing. And there was Marigold, smaller than the rest, quieter, endlessly curious, forever drifting toward the one corner of the property that nobody else paid any attention to, ignoring the freshest browse in favor of ground that looked, to every human eye, exactly like every other patch of thorn on the place. Colleen learned to read the herd the way she imagined a person might learn to read weather, watching which doe grew restless first, which one hung back near the gate before a storm, which one refused to settle until the whole group had circled the paddock twice. She moved the netting every 3 or 4 days, depending on how hard the browse had been hit, always leaving a little green behind so the roots could recover, always pushing the herd forward before they could strip a section bare down to dirt. Harlan had explained the reasoning to her early on, sketching it out with a stick in the dirt one afternoon, showing her how overgrazing a single spot killed the root system just as surely as bulldozing it while moving animals. Through and tight, timed bursts let the plant recover strength between bites instead of dying from repeated wounds. It was a method as old as livestock farming itself, he told her, older than any machine built to replace it, and cheaper besides, since the only real cost was patience and a willingness to move fence more often than most people cared to. It was slower than a bulldozer, and it was cheaper than dynamite, and it left something behind a bulldozer never could, ground that still had a chance to heal instead of ground that had simply been scraped clean and left to wash away with the next hard rain. Every project like this teaches a person something about time long before it teaches them anything about land. Colleen used to believe that grief worked the way a debt worked, that if she paid enough of it in tears and long nights, it would eventually be settled and she could move on whole again. Out on the Kettle place, watching a goat chew through thorn that had taken 10 years to grow, she started to understand it differently, that some things aren't cleared so much as they are slowly, patiently outlasted, one small bite at a time, without ever once looking finished until suddenly, almost without warning, they are. What does a person owe the version of themselves that existed before the loss? And what does that same person owe the one still standing in the mud afterward, learning to walk a fence line alone? The failures piled up fast that first year, and the journal filled with them in small, steady handwriting, not as complaints, but as data. A September storm shorted out the fencing, and half the herd wandered loose for 2 full days before Colleen found them grazing along the county road. Biscuit got tangled in wild grapevine and came away with a briar gash deep enough to need stitches from the vet in town. A dry spell in late summer cracked the ground before the pasture had even begun to recover, the clay turning to hard plates that cupped rainwater instead of drinking it. And Colleen spent 3 weeks hauling water in barrels on the back of the truck because the temporary trough system couldn't keep up with 11 thirsty does in 90-degree heat. She lost sleep calculating how many more weeks the well, she didn't know, she had yet could have saved her, though of course she had no way of knowing that yet either. Twice that same stretch of summer, Colleen heard coyotes close enough in the dark to keep her awake with a flashlight in one hand and an old shotgun she hoped she'd never have to use in the other, standing at the edge of the paddock listening to the herd shift and stamp until the sound faded back into the tree line. She never fired a single shot that whole first year, but she kept the shotgun leaned by the kitchen door anyway, the way her father used to keep his, more habit than fear by the second month of doing it. Lost 2 paddocks of fence to the storm, she rode in August, rebuilding smarter this time, moving the post to higher ground. Biscuit got out again in September. She wrote a few weeks later, "He's not being bad. He's testing where the boundary actually is, and maybe I am too." There were nights that first winter when the isolation pressed in harder than any of the physical work ever did. Nights when the wind came down off the ridge and rattled the loose tin on the equipment shed until she couldn't tell if it was weather or something worse, and she sat up at the kitchen table with the shotgun across her knees and the journal open in front of her, writing down whatever came to mind, just to hear the scratch of the pen against something that wasn't silence. Some of her old neighbors from outside town called that first year to check on her, gently, carefully, the way people check on someone they suspect might be making a mistake, asking whether she'd thought about coming back to a smaller place closer to people, whether all of this was really necessary. She always thanked them for calling and never once gave them a straight answer, because the honest one, that she needed the work more than she needed the comfort, wasn't one she was ready to say out loud yet. Through that whole hard winter, Harlan kept coming by every few weeks regardless of weather, sometimes just to stand at the fence and watch the herd work a paddock in silence for 20 minutes before he said a word to her at all. He told her once, while they watched Ruth lead the others through a gap in the brush, that the land didn't care how long a person had been sad, it only cared whether they kept showing up. Colleen wrote that line down word for word and underlined it 3 times instead of 2, which was as close as she came that winter to admitting how much she needed to hear it. By early spring, the goats had stripped back enough growth that Colleen could finally walk sections of the property she hadn't laid eyes on since the day she signed the deed. That was when the land began to talk. First, it was a low stone ridge running along the base of a hillside, too straight and too even to be anything but man-made. Weeks later, she found a series of flat terraces cut into a slope, the same kind old-timers once used to slow erosion and hold soil for planting corn. Then came the collapsed remains of what had clearly been an orchard once, gnarled apple trees gone half wild among the young cedars. But it was Marigold who kept returning to one particular spot, a shallow depression near the base of the hollow, pawing at the ground and refusing to move on when the rest of the herd drifted toward fresh browse. Colleen pulled her away from it 3 separate times. The 4th time, she knelt down instead. Beneath a mat of vines and decades of leaf litter, her hands found stone, not scattered stone but fitted stone, laid by hand, curved into a perfect circle. It took 2 full weekends of careful digging to expose what lay underneath the vines and silt. A 19th-century stone-lined spring well stood revealed, built with the kind of dry-stack craftsmanship that took real time and real skill to get right. When she finally cleared enough debris to look down into it, she saw water, cold and clear, still moving quietly after more than 100 years of being forgotten by everyone above ground. Colleen sat back on the wet earth and didn't say a word for a long while, running her fingers along the seam where one hand-fitted stone met the next, trying to picture the person who had knelt in this exact spot more than 100 years earlier, doing the exact same work with far fewer tools than she had. She thought about Daniel then, the way she still did at odd moments she couldn't predict, and wondered whether he would have laughed at her for crying over a hole full of water, or whether he would have understood exactly why she was. Found the well today, she wrote later that evening. It was never lost, it was only waiting. A visit to the County Historical Society, followed by a patient afternoon spent with an elderly land surveyor, confirmed most of what Harlan had suspected from the very first day he stood at her gate. The property had once belonged to one of the earliest homestead families in the Hollow, and the well had supplied water not just to that farm, but to neighboring families and cattle drovers moving stock through the region long before the modern county road ever existed. This wasn't a treasure story in the way people wanted treasure stories to be told. There was no gold buried in a coffee tin, no dramatic twist waiting under the floorboards. What Colleen had uncovered was quieter than that, and in its own way, worth more. A genuine piece of the county's working history, still functional, still giving up cold water after being written off by everyone who came before her. The surveyor spread old plat maps across the tailgate of her truck and traced a faint line in pencil showing where a drover's trail had once crossed the property before the county road existed, explaining that wells like this one were often the only reliable water for miles along a cattle route, dug by hand over months, lined stone by men who had no other way to move a herd safely through dry country. Harlan stood off to the side during that conversation and didn't say much, but Colleen noticed him nodding slowly at certain parts of it, as though the land had finally caught up to a conversation the two of them had been having in questions for almost a year. He told her afterward, in his usual roundabout way, that a well like that wasn't just a hole full of water. It was proof that somebody before her had also stood on ground everyone else had given up on and decided it was worth the effort anyway. Word of the discovery spread through Millbrook faster than Colleen expected, and it wasn't long before a man named Roy Denon came calling on behalf of a regional development group. Roy arrived in a pressed suit and a clean pair of shoes that had clearly never touched a pasture before, carrying a leather briefcase and a folder full of numbers he seemed very sure of. He was polite in the way that people are polite right before they try to take something from you, complimenting the land, complimenting her grit, circling slowly toward the reliable water source and the road frontage his company needed for a planned rural subdivision. Roy came back a second time before the offer itself changed. Walking the fence line beside her with his clean shoes catching burrs he didn't seem to notice, asking careful questions about the well's flow rate and the road frontage along Kettle Hollow Road, writing her answers down in a small notebook of his own that looked nothing like the one she carried. He was careful never to raise his voice or press too hard, and in a strange way she almost respected that about him. The patience of a man used to getting what he wanted eventually simply by being pleasant long enough. His first offer was modest and easy to refuse. His second offer, 3 weeks later, was not modest at all, and for a moment even Colleen sat with it longer than she expected to. She thought of Daniel, and of the empty house she'd sold outside town, and of how much easier certain years might have gone if money like that had shown up sooner. Then she thought of Ruth leading the herd through the gate every single morning without being asked twice, and of Biscuit testing every fence he ever met, and of Marigold pawing patiently at ground nobody else believed was worth a second look. "I didn't buy 30 acres of thorns to sell 30 acres of water," she told Roy Denon, and she closed the door on the second offer the same way she'd closed it on the first. Word of the discovery moved through Millbrook the way any good story moves through a small county, growing a little with every telling, until by the time it reached the far end of the hollow, some versions had Colleen finding buried coin instead of buried stone. She never bothered correcting anyone. What mattered to her wasn't the shape of the rumor, but the water itself, tested clean by the county extension office within a week and declared safe enough to run straight into a proper trough system for the first time since she'd bought the place. With a dependable water source finally restored, everything on the Kettle place began to change at once. The rotational grazing system Colleen had been building on faith alone finally had the reliability it needed to work the way it was supposed to. Pasture recovered faster than she had dared hope through the winter, the hard-packed clay softening under regular rain now that the trough system kept the herd from tearing up the ground around a single failing water point. Deer and wild turkey returned to fields that had stood choked in briar for the better part of a decade. And some mornings Colleen counted 6 or 7 deer grazing at the tree line before sunrise, standing in ground a year earlier hadn't held anything taller than a thorn cane. She started keeping a second small notebook just for what she saw at dawn, separate from the working journal, because it felt wrong to file a wild turkey brood under the same pages as fence repairs and vet bills. Even Roy Denton, on that last visit before his letter arrived, stopped halfway back to his truck to watch a hawk circle low over the far pasture. And for just a moment his negotiator's composure slipped enough that Colleen saw something almost like envy cross his face before he caught himself and put it away again. Neighbors who had written off their own overgrown ground for years started showing up at her gate, the same way Harlan once had, asking careful, curious questions about how she'd done it. A retired railroad man 2 farms over admitted he'd been staring at 15 acres of the same multiflora rows for 6 years, too discouraged to start and too proud to ask, until he saw Colleen's pasture from the county road one afternoon and pulled his truck over just to look at it properly. She walked his ground with him the following weekend, the same way Harlan had once walked hers, and found herself asking questions instead of giving answers, surprised at how naturally the habit had taken root in her over a single year. He borrowed 4 of her does that spring to start his own paddock rotation, and when he brought them back fat and glossy in the fall, he brought a jar of his wife's canned peaches along with them, which Colleen decided was payment enough. By the following spring, Colleen was hosting small workshops on brush clearing and rotational grazing right there on the Kettle Hollow property, standing where the thorn wall used to be, teaching other people what a decade of neglect could still become in the right hands. A local elementary school brought 2 classes out one May morning to see the old well and meet the goats, and Colleen found herself standing at the edge of the same paddock where Ruth once led the herd through fresh briar, explaining rotational grazing to a row of children who wanted to know mostly where the biscuit bit. Harlan came to that same workshop, standing at the back the way he always had, not saying much, watching Colleen answer questions with the same steady patience he'd once used on her. Roy Denton sent one more letter that spring. Not another offer this time, just a short note saying he understood her decision and wishing her well with the property, which Colleen read twice before folding it into the back of her journal instead of throwing it away. By the second autumn, the county extension office asked if they could bring a small film crew out to document the rotational grazing setup for a regional agriculture bulletin, and Colleen found herself standing at the same gate where a man had once laughed at her for 30 acres of thorns, explaining paddock rotation into a microphone while Ruth grazed unbothered in the background and Biscuit tried repeatedly to eat the boom pole. The farm that had sold for $180 became something the whole hollow pointed to with pride instead of pity. Some evenings Colleen still walks the fence line alone after the goats are settled, the way she used to walk it in that first hard winter, except the ground under her boots feels different now, less like something she is fighting and more like something she finally understands. She still keeps the shotgun by the kitchen door out of habit, though she can't remember the last time she needed the flashlight to go with it. She still hauls water some dry weeks when the trough runs low, though never for 3 straight weeks the way she once did before the well gave up its secret. And she still writes in the journal most evenings, though the entries have changed shape somewhat. Fewer lists of what broke that day and more small observations. The color of the light over the ridge, which doe kidded first that spring, how the well water tastes different depending on how recently it's rained. These days Colleen still carries the same leather journal. Its cover softer now, its pages nearly full. Ruth still leads the herd through the gate every single morning, first as always. Biscuit still tests every fence he meets, out of habit more than rebellion at this point. And Marigold still wanders back to that same corner of the pasture some mornings, standing quietly near the well as if she remembers exactly what she found buried there. Harlan still comes by every few weeks, slower now than he used to be, still asking questions instead of answers. Though these days Colleen finds herself answering most of them before he even finishes asking, which he says is the whole point of a good question in the first place. The retired railroad man, 2 farms over still borrows, does most springs, and his wife still sends peaches back with them every fall, and between the 2 properties the county road now runs past nearly 50 acres that used to be nothing but thorn and cedar as far as anyone driving by could tell. Roy Denton's company built its subdivision 2 counties over instead, on flatter ground with less history buried under it, and Colleen heard through the county grapevine that it sold well enough. Though she never once regretted the letter she folded into the back of her journal instead of the check she never signed. The well had never truly been lost. It had simply been waiting for someone patient enough and stubborn enough to kneel down and find it. On a clear evening near the end of that first full year, Colleen walked out to the well alone, sat down on the flat stone rim, and looked into the water without saying anything at all, the low autumn light catching the surface, Ruth grazing somewhere behind her, Biscuit testing a fence post out of habit, and Marigold standing close by, watching the same still water Colleen was watching, both of them quiet, both of them exactly where they were meant to be. The well had never truly been lost, only waiting for someone patient enough to kneel down and find it. Some of the best things we ever build come from ground everyone else already gave up on. If this one stayed with you, we'd love to know, have you ever found value in something everyone else had walked away from?